In 1847, a married couple from Pennsylvania posed for what seemed like an ordinary daguerreotype portrait. The man in his stiff black suit, the woman in her brooch and lace collar. Their faces were solemn, as was the custom of the time. Welcome back to this channel, where forgotten history and unsettling mysteries come to light. At first glance, the photograph is just another relic from the Victorian era. But when researchers recently restored and magnified the image, they discovered something no one could explain. Details so disturbing, the portrait has been locked away by private collectors. This is the story of the 1847 couple's portrait, and the terrifying secret hidden within it. Today, we travel back to the year 1847, to a time when America was still young, and photography was a rare and expensive treasure. Families dressed in their best clothes sat stiffly before the large box cameras and waited for their faces to be captured forever. These early photographs, called daguerreotypes, were not just pictures. They were seen as mirrors of the soul, a way to preserve life itself. Our story begins in a quiet town in Pennsylvania. In the summer of 1847, a man and his wife walked into a small photography studio on Main Street. The couple was not wealthy, but they had saved enough money to have their likeness preserved, a luxury for most at that time. The husband was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark suit with a bow tie neatly tied around his collar. His hair was slicked back, and a thick mustache covered his upper lip. He looked stern, as though the weight of life rested heavily upon him. The wife sat beside him, dressed in a long black gown with delicate patterns stitched into the fabric. Around her neck hung a brooch, a small oval piece of jewelry with a lock of hair sealed inside, common in those days as a token of memory. Her hair was parted down the middle and pulled back tightly, her expression cold, almost distant. The photographer prepared the camera. Unlike today, there was no clicking sound, no flash. The exposure took long seconds. The couple had to sit perfectly still, staring directly into the lens, their expressions frozen. Smiles were rare in these photographs. People believed smiling was unnatural, even foolish, when capturing something as permanent as an image of their soul. When the portrait was complete, the daguerreotype was sealed behind glass and placed in a small wooden case lined with velvet. To anyone who saw it, it was simply a husband and wife of the mid-19th century, captured in the fashion of the time. For years, the portrait remained within the family's belongings, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. It survived wars, house fires, and even floods. Until, more than a century later, in the late 20th century, a historian stumbled upon it at an estate sale. At first, he thought it was just another relic. He purchased it, along with several other artifacts, and stored it in his collection. But what he discovered years later would shock him. At first, the historian placed the photograph on a shelf in his study among dozens of other daguerreotypes. It was nothing special. He occasionally used it for lectures when speaking about early photography. Students would lean forward, squinting at the faded details, curious about the stiff, ghostly faces of long-dead strangers. But in the 1990s, when technology made it possible to digitally scan and enlarge images, the historian decided to preserve his collection by scanning each piece into his computer. That's when he noticed something unusual. When he magnified the portrait of the 1847 couple, his heart froze. The husband's eyes, though faded with time, seemed too sharp, too intense, as if they were staring directly at him through the screen. At higher resolution, it looked almost as though the pupils were not human at all, but elongated, dark slits, like the eyes of some animal. The wife's face was even more unsettling. Her lips, pressed tightly together in the original, now appeared, slightly parted when enlarged, and between them the faint outline of teeth, too many teeth, sharp and uneven, not fitting the shape of a normal human mouth. The historian blinked, thinking it was an illusion caused by the grain of the daguerreotype, but when he enlarged it again, the details grew clearer, not fuzzier. Behind the woman's shoulder, something else seemed to emerge. The faint outline of another face, too small and too distorted to belong to a living person. It was almost like a child's face pressed into the shadows, its eyes wide and mouth open in a silent scream. He pushed back from his desk, his skin crawling. That night, he could not sleep. He kept returning to the scanned image, zooming in, zooming out, convinced his mind was playing tricks. Yet each time, the details only became more obvious. On the third night, something happened that changed his life. While staring at the screen, he heard a faint sound. At first he thought it came from outside, a passing car, a neighbor's television. But then he realized the sound was coming from his computer speakers. It was a whisper, so faint it could barely be heard. The voice seemed to say a name. He leaned closer, straining his ears, and it came again. Eliza. His heart pounded. Eliza. Could that have been the wife's name? He checked the back of the wooden daguerreotype case, and there, scratched faintly into the wood, were two words: Eliza and Thomas. The whisper had spoken her name. The historian tried to tell his colleagues about what he found, but they laughed. They said his imagination was running wild, that old photographs often held strange patterns and textures. But he could not shake the feeling that the portrait was different, that it was alive. Night after night he returned to the image. Each time he stared into it, he noticed something new. Sometimes the husband's expression seemed to change, the corners of his mouth twitching into what looked like a faint grin. Sometimes the wife's eyes seemed wider, her pupils dark holes that threatened to swallow him whole, and always, faintly, came the whisper. Sometimes it was her name. Sometimes it was something else, a warning, a command, or a prayer. Soon he stopped sleeping altogether. His house became filled with notes and sketches of the photograph. He traced the family's history, searching for records of Thomas and Eliza, but strangely, he found almost nothing. Census records listed them only once, in 1847, the same year the portrait was taken. After that, nothing. It was as if the couple had vanished from history. The historian later told a close friend that he believed the daguerreotype was cursed. Whoever stared too long at it would begin to see things that were not there. He said he once saw the glass covering the photograph fog up as if someone inside had exhaled. Another time he swore the wife blinked, but the most terrifying moment came when he dreamed, if it was a dream at all. He was sitting in his study when he felt a presence behind him. Slowly, he turned, and there stood Eliza, dressed in her black gown, her brooch glinting in the faint light. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open, and behind her teeth he saw the impossible row of fangs he had glimpsed in the photograph. She leaned close and whispered into his ear, "Not forgotten." When he woke, the daguerreotype had fallen from its shelf. The glass was cracked, and a thin line of blood ran down his arm, though he had no memory of cutting himself. This was only the beginning. The portrait from 1847, it seemed, was not just an image. It was a doorway, and what lay beyond was darker than anyone could imagine. The historian could not escape the feeling that Thomas and Eliza's portrait was more than just a photograph. It felt like a clue, a piece of something larger, hidden and dangerous. He decided the only way to find answers was to go back to where the portrait was taken. After weeks of digging, he discovered the studio's name: Harrington's Photographic Rooms, Pennsylvania, 1847. The building no longer existed, but the town itself, though small and almost forgotten, still stood. It was a quiet place, surrounded by hills and forests, with more abandoned homes than occupied ones. Fewer than 400 people lived there now, most of them old, most of them suspicious of strangers. The historian arrived on a gray afternoon. The town felt stuck in time. Weathered barns leaned against the wind. The church bell tower was crooked, the metal rusting. A few children played silently in the street, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes as he parked his car. He asked about the portrait, showing a copy of the photograph to the town clerk. The man's face drained of color the moment he saw it. His hands trembled as he pushed the picture back across the desk. "You shouldn't have brought this here," the clerk whispered. "They don't like to be remembered." The historian's skin prickled. "Who doesn't?" he asked. The clerk leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Thomas and Eliza, and the others. Best you leave tonight." But the historian couldn't. Something in him burned with obsession. He needed to know what had happened here. Why had the couple vanished from history? Why had their faces been sealed in a photograph that whispered names at night? That evening, he walked into the town's only tavern. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp clothes. A few old men sat hunched over their drinks, barely speaking. At a corner table sat an old woman with white hair pulled back in a tight bun. She watched him with sharp eyes that seemed too alive for someone so frail. When he approached, she gestured for him to sit. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said without introduction. Her voice was raspy, as though she hadn't spoken in days. The historian hesitated, then nodded. "The photograph," she whispered. "The couple in black, Thomas and Eliza." He leaned forward. "You know them?" She looked around the tavern, making sure no one else was listening. "Everyone in this town knows them, but no one dares to speak their names aloud. You must leave while you still can." "Please," the historian insisted. "Tell me." The old woman sighed. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her mug. Then, in a low voice, she began to tell the story. In 1847, she explained, the town had been thriving. Families moved there for farmland and opportunity. That was when Thomas and Eliza arrived. They were not farmers. They kept to themselves in a house at the edge of the woods, a house no one else had wanted. At first, people thought they were ordinary. But soon, strange things began to happen. Livestock went missing. Children woke in the night screaming of voices outside their windows. Some said they saw shadows moving through the fields even when the moon was hidden. And then, people began to vanish. One by one, entire families disappeared. Doors left open, food half prepared on the table, chairs tipped over, as if something had taken them suddenly. By the end of the year, nearly half the town was gone. Suspicion fell on Thomas and Eliza. But when the townspeople confronted them, they found nothing unusual. Just the husband and wife sitting calmly in their parlor, the fireplace glowing. They spoke politely, offered tea, and denied everything. Yet the disappearances did not stop. "Do you know why they had their portrait taken?" the old woman asked. The historian shook his head. They said it was for remembrance. But people whispered it was a ritual, a way of binding themselves to this world. You see, the old photographers believed that taking a picture was dangerous. They believed it could steal a piece of the soul. But Thomas and Eliza wanted that. They wanted their souls sealed inside the glass so they would never be forgotten, never destroyed. The historian's stomach turned. He thought of the whispers he had heard when scanning the image. Could it be true? Could their souls still be inside the photograph, trapped but alive? The old woman leaned closer. Her breath smelled of smoke and age. "Some say the portrait is a doorway, a mirror that looks both ways. When you stare too long, they stare back. And when they look at you long enough, they follow." The historian left the tavern shaken, but more determined than ever. He had to see the house where Thomas and Eliza lived. The next morning, he hiked to the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and the path turned muddy. Birds did not sing there. The forest was silent, as if listening. At last he came upon it, a ruined house leaning under the weight of years, its windows black and broken. The door creaked open with a touch. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rot and dust. Furniture lay scattered. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing strange symbols scratched into the wood beneath. Circles, crossed lines, shapes that seemed to twist the longer he stared at them. In the parlor, he found a burned patch on the floor, as though a fire had been started there long ago. Around the edges of the burn were more carvings, words in a language he did not recognize, and on the mantel, half buried in dust, was another photograph case. His hand shook as he picked it up. The glass was cracked, the image inside almost completely faded. But as he tilted it toward the light, he saw it. Two faces, faint but unmistakable. Thomas and Eliza. Only this time, they were not seated together. They were standing behind a group of townspeople, their hands on their shoulders as if claiming them. The townspeople's eyes were wide, their mouths open in silent terror. The historian dropped the case. His skin crawled. The whispers began again, faint but insistent, echoing through the empty house. "Eliza, Thomas, remember us." He fled the house, but the whispers followed. That night, back at his inn, he woke to find the daguerreotype of Thomas and Eliza lying on the floor, though he had locked it in his suitcase. The glass was fogged, as if someone inside had breathed against it. And when he wiped the glass clean, he saw something new. In the background of the photograph, behind Thomas and Eliza's stiff, frozen bodies, was his own reflection. The historian barely slept after seeing his reflection in the old portrait. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt eyes watching him, cold and patient. He left the lamp on, but shadows still crept across the room, bending and twisting as if pulled toward the photograph lying on the desk. By morning he was pale, trembling, but more determined. He told himself he wasn't afraid, that this was only an image, just paper and glass. Yet when he touched it, the surface felt warm, like skin. At first, the voices were faint, like a breeze through cracks in the window, but now they grew stronger, clearer. Sometimes it was Eliza's voice. "We remember you. We see you." Other times it was Thomas. "Join us. Stand with us." The historian tried to ignore it, drowning the voices in books, scouring every local record for answers. He learned of families who vanished after visiting the couple's home. He read accounts of children who claimed to see Thomas and Eliza in their dreams. He found faded church notes calling the portrait a vessel of binding. The deeper he dug, the stronger the whispers became. And the stronger the whispers, the more the photograph began to change. At first, it was small things. The background behind Thomas and Eliza seemed darker than before. Their clothes appeared cleaner, newer, as though time inside the glass was running backward. Then, their faces shifted. Eliza's lips curved into a faint smile. Thomas's eyes, once dull from age, now gleamed with a sharp, knowing light. They were no longer frozen in time. They were alive, watching. One night, as he studied the image with shaking hands, Eliza's gaze slid from the camera to him. Her head turned slightly, so slight he thought he had imagined it. But when he blinked, her eyes were still locked on his. The historian stumbled back, heart pounding. He shoved the portrait into his bag, but the whispers filled the room anyway. Now loud, urgent, overlapping in a chorus, "Stay with us. We are waiting." Desperate to prove he wasn't losing his mind, he set up an experiment. He placed the daguerreotype on his desk and positioned a mirror behind him so he could record what he saw. At first, everything looked ordinary. The stiff couple frozen in their 1847 pose. But when he turned to check the recording, his blood ran cold. In the mirror's reflection, Thomas and Eliza were no longer sitting. They were standing behind him, their pale hands stretched toward his shoulders. He slammed the mirror to the ground. It shattered into 100 pieces, but even then he swore he saw them, fragments of their faces in every shard, smiling. Panicked, he returned to the old woman in the tavern. Her expression hardened the moment he told her what he had seen. "You fool," she whispered. "You've let them notice you. That is how it begins." "How do I stop it?" he asked. His voice cracked. "How do I break it?" She shook her head slowly. "You don't. No one breaks it. Once you stare too long, they follow. First in dreams, then in reflections. And finally," she leaned closer, her breath shaking. "Finally, they step out." The historian's mouth went dry. "Step out? They've done it before," the woman said. "That is why families vanished. Why half this town was swallowed in silence. The portrait is not just a memory. It's a door, and you have opened it." That night, he dreamed of the couple's house. The parlor glowed with firelight, but the flames gave no warmth. Thomas and Eliza sat in their chairs, smiling, waiting. The empty chairs around them were filled with townspeople, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their lips sewn shut with black thread. Eliza patted the chair beside her. "Come sit," she said sweetly. "You've earned your place." When he woke, his throat was raw as if he had been screaming all night. The photograph lay on the nightstand, though he swore he had locked it in the desk drawer. And this time, when he looked at it, there was something new. Behind Thomas and Eliza, faint and ghostly, was his own face, pale, frightened, trapped. The historian tried to flee the town. He packed his things and drove into the night, the portrait shoved deep in his bag. But the farther he went, the more wrong the world became. The road stretched endlessly, the trees all looking the same. His headlights flickered, and shadows flickered with them. Once he thought he saw Eliza standing at the roadside, her black dress whipping in the wind. When he passed, she was gone, but in his rearview mirror, she was sitting in the back seat, smiling. He swerved the car, heart hammering. The back seat was empty, but the whispers filled the car now, louder than ever. "Don't leave. You belong to us." Hours later, when he finally stumbled back into town, exhausted and terrified, he realized the truth. There was no escape. The photograph wasn't just in his bag anymore. It was inside him. On the last night, he set the photograph on the table and forced himself to look. Thomas's face had sharpened, his features almost modern, almost alive. Eliza's eyes sparkled as though she could see through the glass into the room itself. And then he saw it, clear as day. A third figure had appeared in the portrait, standing just behind them. His own figure. The historian dropped to his knees. The whispers filled the room, chanting his name. The glass of the portrait fogged again, but this time words formed on it, words written from the inside. "Welcome home." The historian no longer knew how many days had passed since the portrait found him. He ate little, slept even less. Every surface of his rented room seemed alive with shadows. The old clock on the mantel ticked slower than before, its pendulum swinging as though time itself was struggling to keep up with him. The photograph now sat on the desk, uncovered. He had tried to hide it, lock it away, even bury it under books, but somehow it always returned to the same spot, angled perfectly so that Thomas and Eliza's eyes never left him. At first, they seemed to only watch, but now they smiled, and behind them the shadow of his figure grew sharper with each passing day. One morning, he walked through the town hoping the fresh air would free his mind, but the streets were empty. The tavern was closed, the market stalls abandoned. Curtains hung over windows like veils, and yet he felt unseen eyes studying him from behind the glass. It was as if the whole town had recoiled, waiting for him to disappear the way so many before him had. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the cobblestones. Even the crows, once noisy in the square, had vanished. When he reached the edge of town, the same road greeted him again. Twisting trees, the endless dirt path. He turned back, but when he looked up, he was standing once more in front of the tavern. No matter where he went, the town looped back on itself, and always the whispers followed. That night, as rain lashed the windows, he heard it. 3 slow knocks on his door. His breath caught. The knocks came again, louder. He froze in his chair, eyes darting to the desk where the portrait lay. In the glass, Thomas's hand was raised as though mid-knock. Eliza's lips were parted, caught in a smile too wide, too sharp. The door creaked open on its own. No one stood there, just darkness. But when he turned back, the portrait had changed again. The door behind Thomas and Eliza, the painted wooden door in the background of their parlor, was now slightly ajar. And in that crack, a sliver of movement. A pale hand reaching through. Terrified, he ran to the old woman at the tavern again. This time, she didn't even let him step inside. She met him at the door, eyes wide with fear. "It's too late," she whispered. "I told you not to look. The more you see, the more they hold you." "I didn't mean," he stammered. Her hand trembled as she clutched his arm. "Do you want to live? Then listen. Burn it. Destroy the glass. Tear it apart before they take you fully." The historian's heart leapt. A way out. A chance. He nodded quickly, desperate, but her grip tightened and her voice dropped lower. Be warned. If you burn it, the door may not close. It may only open faster. Decide which fate you can bear. And with that, she slammed the tavern door in his face. Back in his room, he set the portrait on the floor. His hands shook as he struck a match. For a moment, the flame gave him courage, its warmth pushing back the cold. He touched the match to the edge of the photograph. The flame caught, crackling hungrily against the old paper. The smoke rose in twisting shapes, like faces screaming in silence. But then, an impossible thing happened. The fire stopped. It didn't go out. It froze. The flame stiffened in midair, like a painting, locked in time. And then slowly, it reversed. The fire pulled backward into the paper, leaving it whole again. Perfect. Untouched. Thomas and Eliza were smiling wider than ever, and the shadow of the historian, his own reflection, inside the portrait, was no longer behind them. It was besides them. That night, the whispers turned into voices, hundreds of them, layered and overlapping. They came from the corners of the room, from the cracks in the floor, from the glass itself. He covered his ears, but the sound grew louder, until it felt like his skull would split. And then he realized the voices weren't only speaking, they were chanting, calling his name, over and over. The photograph fogged once more, as if breath pressed against the inside of the glass. This time. It wasn't words that appeared. It was fingerprints, dozens of them, pressing, clawing, trying to push through. The desk shook violently. The lamp shattered. The air went cold, every candle snuffed out at once. And from the portrait, the faint sound of a door creaking open. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in his room anymore. He was standing in a dimly lit parlor, the smell of dust and rot filling the air. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper curling at the edges. A fireplace glowed faintly, though no fire burned within it. In the center of the room sat Thomas and Eliza, exactly as they appeared in the photograph. Their faces, however, were alive, flesh and blood, pale and smiling. Around them, in every empty chair, sat townsfolk. Their faces were blank, their skin gray, their eyes cloudy as if made of glass. Eliza lifted her hand gently, motioning to the empty chair beside her. "You came at last," she said, her voice smooth, almost kind. "You've been in the portrait for some time now. We were only waiting for you to notice." The historian stumbled backward, but the door behind him had vanished. There was only wallpaper, endless and suffocating. Thomas leaned forward, his cold eyes gleaming. "Do not fear. You will not be alone. We all live here now." The historian's chest tightened as he looked at the townsfolk. Men, women, children, all frozen in silence. They weren't dead. They weren't alive. They were trapped, preserved like insects in amber. And then he saw himself. Across the room, in a tall standing mirror, was his own reflection, but it wasn't moving as he was. It sat calmly in the empty chair beside Eliza, smiling. His body trembled. He reached for the mirror, but his reflection only smiled wider, leaning closer to Eliza as though already part of her world. The historian screamed, slamming his fists against the glass. The reflection's lips moved, whispering words he could not hear. And then it hit him. He was no longer in control, he was only watching. His reflection had taken his place. And somewhere, back in the real world, the portrait of Thomas and Eliza had changed once again. This time it showed three figures smiling together. The historian's scream echoed through the parlor, but no sound left his lips. His body no longer obeyed him. He felt heavy, as though invisible hands were pressing him down into the chair. Thomas and Eliza sat on either side, their smiles gentle. Too gentle, like parents welcoming a child into their home. Their hands rested on the armrests, close enough that he felt the cold of their skin. The townsfolk remained still, each one staring forward with blank, glassy eyes. Their silence was suffocating, louder than any scream. And then Eliza leaned closer. "You've seen what lies behind the glass," she whispered. Her breath was icy, her words brushing against his ear. "Now you belong to it." The historian tried to stand, but the chair gripped him. It was not wood that held him, it was glass. He looked down and saw transparent shards forming around, his wrists and ankles binding him in place. They dug into his skin without cutting, like frozen chains. The glass grew thicker, spreading across his arms and legs, crawling over his chest. With each passing second, he could feel it pulling something from him. Not his blood, but his reflection. His body shook violently, his vision blurring. Across the parlor, the mirror showed his reflection smiling calmly, already seated, already whole. He realized with horror, the glass wasn't trapping his body. It was sealing his soul. The silence broke. The townsfolk moved at last. Not much, only their lips. One by one, they began to whisper in unison. The sound filled the room like a storm, words layered over words until they became impossible to understand. But the rhythm was unmistakable, a chant, a ritual, and at the center of it, Thomas spoke clearly. Every portrait must have balance. One leaves, another enters. That is the law of the frame. The historian's throat tightened as he shook his head. No, please, I didn't choose this. Eliza only smiled. Choice is for the living. You step beyond when you look too long. The old door in the background of the parlor groaned open wider. The same door that had been painted into the portrait now loomed at the far wall, its frame stretching unnaturally tall, its hinges shrieking like metal tearing apart. A freezing wind blew through, though the world beyond was only black. The historian felt the pull. The darkness behind the door was alive, reaching for him with invisible hands, dragging him closer with each whisper. The glass binding his body pulsed like a heartbeat. He screamed again, but the sound was devoured instantly, swallowed by the chant of the townsfolk. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. Thomas leaned forward, his voice the only sound in the room. There is one way out, the historian gasped, desperate. Tell me, please, I'll do anything. Thomas's eyes glinted like a blade catching light. Give another in your place. The frame demands balance. It always has. Eliza reached out and gently touched his cheek, her smile soft as a knife. It does not matter who. Only that they look. Only that they see. The glass will welcome them, and you will walk free. The historian's heart pounded in his chest. Images raced through his mind, his colleagues, his students, even strangers in the tavern. Could he condemn another to this fate? But the thought of endless eternity inside the glass, trapped with these silent souls, made his stomach twist with terror. His lips trembled. I can find someone. Eliza's smile widened, her teeth sharp in the flickering light. Good. The chains of glass loosened. The parlor faded. The townsfolk's whispers quieted to a hum, then to nothing. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his rented room. The portrait sat on the desk once again. Only now it was different. Thomas and Eliza were smiling, as always. But beside them, his reflection no longer appeared. The space was empty, waiting. His body was drenched in sweat. His throat ached from screaming. For a brief, trembling moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But then he saw his wrists. Thin, jagged lines of glass shimmered beneath his skin, glowing faintly in the dark, and from the portrait came a whisper, low and sweet. Bring them. He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning. For air. His mind raced. He could walk away, leave the town, leave the portrait. Pretend none of it ever happened. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The frame was waiting. The voices were waiting. And the door was still open. The only way out was the bargain. The historian's eyes burned with guilt as he looked at the portrait. The empty space beside Thomas and Eliza seemed to pull at him, urging him forward, whispering promises of freedom, if only he delivered another. He buried his face in his hands. He knew what he would do. The historian did not sleep that night. He sat hunched over the desk, the candle burned low, and the portrait stared back at him. The empty space beside Thomas and Eliza was a wound in the painting, dark, raw, waiting to be filled. Every time he looked away, he heard it, the faint scrape of glass, the echo of whispers pressing at the edge of his mind. The promise lingered in every breath. Bring them. By morning, his decision was made. At the inn's breakfast table, a young traveler sat alone, humming softly while sketching in a notebook. The historian's eyes locked on her. She was curious, bright-eyed, curiosity strong enough to draw her toward danger. He forced a smile, sat across from her, and began speaking of local history, weaving in stories of the strange portrait he had uncovered. Her interest bloomed just as he knew it would. By dusk, she stood in his rented room staring at the painting. "It's beautiful," she whispered, leaning closer. The historian's stomach twisted. He wanted to stop her, to shove the canvas into the fire. But he said nothing. Her fingers brushed the frame. The candlelight flickered. And then, just like before, the air grew cold. The glass whispered, and she vanished. The portrait changed. Thomas and Eliza were smiling. And beside them, the young traveler now stood frozen, her eyes wide, her mouth open mid-breath, trapped forever. The empty space was gone. For now. The historian collapsed to his knees, sobbing into his hands. He had done it. He had fed the frame. He was free, or so he thought. That night, the whispers returned, louder, closer, crawling into his ears as though spoken from inside his own skull. The portrait's surface rippled like water. New cracks spread across the glass, long, jagged, reaching outward like veins. The canvas was not satisfied. One offering was not enough. It would never be enough. The escape. The historian panicked. He tried to burn the portrait, but the flames bent away from it. He tried to smash it, but the wood and glass remained unbroken. And then he realized the truth. The frame was not bound to the portrait. The frame was bound to him. As long as he lived, it would demand balance. Every reflection he caught in a mirror, every face he saw too long in glass, it would hunger. And if he failed, the door would open again. The curse was no longer trapped in Culpeper. It was loose, walking in his shadow. The legacy of glass years later, the portrait vanished from the archives, stolen or hidden away. But stories surfaced, whispers of people vanishing after gazing too long into certain antique mirrors, of portraits that seemed to change their figures when no one was watching. Some claimed to hear voices in the glass, calling their names, begging them closer. And always at the edges of the reflection, two figures stood smiling, Thomas and Eliza, waiting patiently. Because the frame was never just wood and glass. It was a door, and once a door opens, it never truly closes. And that was the story of the couple's portrait from 1847, the painting that revealed more than just a memory. A story of love, loss, and something darker, something that refused to die. But remember, behind every artifact, every forgotten file, and every piece of history, there might be more than just dust and age. There might be a secret waiting for someone foolish enough to look too closely. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, don't forget to subscribe. Every time you do, it motivates me to keep searching, to keep uncovering the stories America and the world tried to bury. Your support helps bring more of these chilling tales to light, and I promise the next one may be even darker. So, stay curious, stay cautious, and never trust what stares back at you from the glass. Until next time, this is Behind the Genius signing off.